Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Purple Insider. Matthew Coller here along with Manny Hill. I am once again in my father-in-law's office, so it's a little dark, but we look fine. We're going to roll along. Manny Hill, as usual, here on a Monday evening. And it's a little weird, Manny, because normally we're just still reacting to what we saw in the game when we get together, but this time it's like several days removed. So let me ask you this. I'm sure that you, along with everybody else in Viking land, after watching that game, was like, what the heck was that? What happened there? How do you lose that ball game? Now that you've had a couple of days to process the fact that Jake Browning went legend by throwing his helmet and yelling, "Don't effing cut me," or whatever he said, and got to dunk on the Vikings in a true revenge game. I mean, we joke about revenge games all the time. A true revenge game. Maybe we should have done a list of revenge games last week, Manny. I never dreamed. But give me your like, all right, I'm calm. Here's my takeaway from the ball game reaction.
I felt, when we talked Thursday, I felt like this was a game the Vikings were probably going to lose. I picked them to lose it, just because of, the way things had gone for them offensively the last couple of weeks. And, I was surprised to see them, be as productive offensively as they were. They put up over 400 yards of offense. It was just the turnovers that ultimately were the difference in the game. And Cincinnati made some plays, and T Higgins, man, T Higgins is just a beast, man. He's fantastic, and he doesn't get a lot of attention because Jamar Chase is the number one guy there. But he could be T Higgins could be a number one receiver on a lot of teams in this league, and he showed that on Saturday. And so, I feel like I think it's really easy to kind of just look at how everything went down in that game and just sort of pick apart every single thing that went wrong for the Vikings in that game. They gave up a lot of points in the fourth quarter, blew a double-digit lead. Nick Mullins threw, three really bad interceptions, two that counted. And so, I think it's really easy to kind of look at all those things and just be apoplectic and want Kevin O'Connell to be fired and trade this guy and cut this guy, and this is awful, and they blew it and all this other stuff. But I think what it really just kind of shows is that this team is not that good. They're not ready yet to make that, that next step and make any noise in the postseason. And I think that's okay. I mean, I think based off of what, and this team has been up and down all season long, and they got out to a bad start, got a nice winning streak, put themselves into a position where we're thinking, okay, well, let's see what happens with Dobbs and everything. And really the last couple of weeks they've come down to earth. And it sucks because the offense has been bad the last couple of weeks. And then this week, they put up a lot of yards and put up enough points that you would think, with the way the defense has been playing, that they would come away with a win. But now you're still kind of expecting your defense to just be completely lights out, and that's just not realistic. For as good as they've been for most of this season, it's not realistic to just think that Brian Flores' defense is just going to pitch a shutout every single week. And so you had to know at some point teams were going to be able to move the ball. And Cincinnati's talented. Joe Burrow isn't playing, but they've got weapons, and they've got a decent offensive line, and Joe Mixon's a good running back. So they've got a lot of stuff to work with there. It's unreasonable, I think, to think that defense was just going to completely shut them down, and the Vikings were going to find a way to win a really low scoring game, and it didn't work out for them. And even with all that said, they still have a shot to make the playoffs if that's kind of what you're rooting for. Personally, I would kind of rather see them drop these last three games and have a higher draft pick, because I don't think they're going to make a lot of noise in the playoffs should they get there anyway. So it's interesting because it feels like my tone of this team has really kind of flipped in the last couple of weeks, just now that they've kind of come back to reality.
Well, and I think, that's fair because after the New Orleans game, we were looking at it like, look, Brian Flores' defense is rolling and Josh Dobbs is going to be able to keep this offense going, and they could pump up the quarterback and they could protect the quarterback and they could get receivers open and everything else. And then it became a little harder to protect the quarterback when everybody knew that he was going to try to run. So that happened. Teams played to the weaknesses of Josh Dobbs, started to shut him down. Also, I do think that there are reasoned criticisms when it comes to Kevin O'Connell, and then there are unreasoned criticisms. But one of the reasoned would be, hey, one would be like, look at Ty Chandler, bro. Like, maybe just
Yeah.
that was a good idea to play him a little more. Or, hey, look, if you could make some more adjustments to Josh Dobbs, maybe you would put up some more points in some of those games that you didn't. But then there's also some of the games that they lost, I mean, including Chicago. But Denver also falls into this category as well, where you're just like, this is the delicate nature of playing with a backup quarterback, where if one thing kind of goes wrong, it can really have a major effect on you. So if the defense against Cincinnati does have this meltdown in the second half, it's hard to expect the Vikings to just go toe to toe with Nick Mullins in there, even though they put up a lot of yards and points. But it's not like if Josh Allen is in a shootout and they're going back and forth and it's like, all right, well, whoever's got the ball last. I mean, it doesn't, and I know people have brought up, well, a backup quarterback beat them. I know. The point is that, like, he was playing well and he was putting up points in that second half. And the Vikings had a few drives, including the tush push one, where they had a chance, but somebody's backup was going to fail eventually, and it turned out to be yours. And next week, it might be theirs, but you're not playing a backup next week. But if you are, then, it might be theirs, right? So that's kind of how it goes. And in a way, that's why it's like I want to listen to all the perspectives on this thing, but I also don't want to get too caught up because of how close they were to having totally different narratives. I mean, if they beat the Denver Broncos and knock a ball down in the end zone, then we're talking about, okay, wow, like this is now a winning streak. And then, if Justin Fields doesn't lead a game winning drive, of which he literally never, ever, ever does that, ever. I mean, look at his career, how many chances he's had to lead game tie and game winning drives. He never does it, including, and it wasn't his fault exactly, but you know, Hail Mary that didn't connect yesterday, but that's not something he's ever been capable of doing. He does it against you. And Jake Browning coming out of nowhere. It just, like, these things have been a little bit all season long, uncontrollable, random, and when something happens, then you don't win because you're not a team that's really built to overcome all the things that you have gone up against. Yet at the same time, you kind of have, because you're in the playoffs, still in the playoff race. So we're losing our minds over the loss and then looking up in the morning and going, oh, actually, there's still more than 50% to make the playoffs if they get, especially if they get a win against the Detroit Lions. So one of the weirder games to try to break down. And I think, and I was walking out of the stadium thinking, like, that's actually a really memorable football game. And we've had a lot of unmemorable football games lately. And I'll tell you what Brian Murphy said, and we can move on to some other stuff. Murph was basically like, folks, just, you can't control this thing. It is a roller coaster with rocket boosters strapped into it. So, like, it was already a roller coaster with Kirk. Just go along for the ride and see what happens. And I think saying that to football fans is basically like saying, I don't know, that space aliens are going to come down and take over football. Because nobody wants to hear, hey, don't overreact to your football team. Just chill and watch the games. But in a way, this thing is so out of control. Is one of the. It's not a weird season for roofs collapsing or people hanging from trusses inside the stadium or whatever, but it's definitely been a weird season for football games, the way that a lot of these have played out. So it's like, I don't know what to tell you, man. Most of the time, I saw Nick Mullins was top 10 in EPA per play for this week for quarterbacks. It's like, if you had told me they were going to get that, I would have said, damn, like that means they're going to play great, I think, right? And they mostly did until they didn't. It was just a weird day.
It really was. And I'll be honest with you, caller. after the game was over, I wasn't even really all that upset because the first thing that kinda came to my mind it was, we've seen the Vikings lose games like that with Kirk Cousins at quarterback. I mean, how many times have we seen it? Hell, the last time they were in Cincinnati, was it 2 years ago where they lost the game in overtime? It was the same kind of thing where they're neck and neck with the Bengals, and Dalvin Cook fumbles in overtime, and it ends up costing them the game. The Bengals kick a field goal at the end, and they end up winning it. Same kind of game where you kind of look at this play and that play and say, "Well, man, if they would have just made that play, then they would have won the game." It was the same thing Saturday, where if they execute on the tush push one out of the two times, you know, that could have been the difference in the game between them winning and losing. If T. Higgins makes an incredible catch, getting his hands on the ball, and then somehow, some way, because he's freakishly athletic and he's got these long arms and he just kind of reached his arm around as he's going down and reached the ball across. Like, how do you defend that? Like that there's nothing you can do about that when great players make great plays and just certain things don't go your way and you're playing with a backup quarterback. So you just kind of chalk it up as these things happen, and you just have to kind of accept it for what it is. It's kind of how the season has gone as a whole anyway. So you just accept it and you move forward and you just try to get a win against Detroit.
Yeah, I'll tell you, I didn't really expect the reaction that they got, because I thought that people would be much more like, "Oh man, what a wild way to lose! Classic Vikings and backup quarterback. What are you going to do? Crazy day." And it just, I think those particular plays not working and the kind of strange way that they went about it with Brandon Powell and everybody at the broadcast is talking about it. Everyone's watching the same game. When the whole nation is watching, it gets more attention, and but it really set people off. But you're exactly right. If that was Kirk Cousins and they lost that game, I would have understood much more, because at this point, I think if they had Cousins, there would have been a lot more pressure on this team to make the playoffs rather than a, hey, you started out 0-3, lost your starting quarterback. It's good to even be here type of approach. But now it's only one win in several weeks, and that one win was 3-0. And I think that
Yeah,
tension had been kind of building. Like, this thing is just really sort of teetering and feeling like it's going off the rails. And I would imagine, I know our buddy Will Raggets had this stat about the last 3 years, the one score games, that the Vikings have six more one score games than anybody else. And it's like, just one weekend, can you give these people a rest? Can you stop having them like have heart attacks every single week at the end of these games and not putting people away? And that's another argument about that game as well. It's like you have 95% chance to win or something going in the fourth quarter, and you end up walking away with a loss. So then it feels like, gosh, you should have been there regardless of the backup quarterback thing. So I get it. I mean, I'm not downplaying people's passion for it. I guess that was
right.
just, to me, the most notable thing coming out of the game was just how upset people were. And yet here we are. So why don't we look at the NFC races, Manny? I think that's what we got to do here, right? And what a wild day for everybody. I mean, if you are a New York Giants fan, you thought last week maybe you had your franchise quarterback Tommy DeVito, and somebody asked in a press conference to Brian Dable about Tom Brady and Tommy DeVito, which I guess that went away pretty quickly when they lost 24-6. But let's go through the teams that are battling with the Vikings for this final position, because this race, let me count them up now. We've got one, two, three teams at 7-7, a 6-7 team in Seattle that is playing tonight, and then two 6-8 teams. So let's go through them. The Vikings still somehow holding on to a number 6 seed. The Los Angeles Rams, though, Manny, they seem pretty scary to me. I mean, they played toe to toe with the Baltimore Ravens, lost on a punt return 2 weeks ago, and then they get a big win yesterday with Matthew Stafford. If he's healthy, because he got beat up earlier this year, he is playing some phenomenal football for them. And Sean McVay is not going to get talked about for coach of the year. And that's going to be a really tight race with a lot of coaches that are deserving. But that team was kind of left for dead after what we saw last year. And now they feel like they've come together. Cooper Cup is healthy. Stafford's gunning it all over the place. Their defense is competent. They could very much end up with one of these playoff seeds and are probably the most dangerous team that nobody would really want to face in the playoffs if they did. That's how I view them. How are you looking at the Rams?
Yeah, they're definitely a team to look for, especially when you look at their last 3 games. You know, they've got New Orleans coming up this Thursday, and then, on New Year's Eve, they're gonna take on the Giants on the road. The Giants aren't very good, obviously. And then they got San Francisco in week 18. And that could be interesting because the 49ers might not have anything to play for and might be resting a lot of their starters, which would open up the opportunity for the Rams to, possibly run the table the rest of the way. So, it's a team that's well coached. Sean McVay, as we know, is one of the best, and it's a battle tested team. A lot of players on that team were on that Super Bowl team from 2 years ago. So that's a team you're definitely going to have to keep your eye out for. Took care of business against Washington yesterday. They've just been playing a lot better the last month or so since their bye week, which was week 10. Because before that they went into Green Bay and kind of stunk up the joint back in early November. So they've been really good, playing a lot better. Like you said, they went toe to toe with the Ravens. That's a team you're going to have to really watch here as we get down the stretch of the season.
Yep, I agree. Now, just going kind of rapid fire through these, the New Orleans Saints are one of the weirdest teams in the NFL because every single time you think it's over, they are dead. The Derek Carr experiment totally failed. And we're going to include Tampa Bay in this discussion too, because they're right now in the lead, but still they're also 7-7. So, but New Orleans, I have no idea what I'm supposed to think of them. When they were playing against Josh Dobbs in the Vikings offense, I was like, this is the top 10 ranked defense of the New Orleans Saints. What? And then against the Giants, they're making Tommy DeVito look like he should be back at Syracuse University because he's getting sacked 7 times. They're playing dominant football. I still think they have a good defensive head coach in Dennis Allen, and their offense seems to just ride or die on whether they can convert some of that underneath stuff and get big yards after catch and have their playmakers make plays. I don't think they're a serious contender, but can they win enough games to stay in this race and get one of these spots? I think they can, but if you're the Vikings, that like New Orleans needs more wins than you because you beat them head to head, which is going to make a huge difference there. So what the Vikings need, let's loop in Tampa Bay into this as well. They kind of need like Tampa Bay to stay in that spot at the
Yeah.
top of the division and not New Orleans get the spot. Like if New Orleans were to win 3 in a row and then Tampa Bay wins 2 and then the Vikings don't have the tiebreaker against Tampa Bay. So both let's talk about both of those teams. I think New Orleans is weird, but I actually think Tampa Bay might be pretty legit. I mean, Baker Mayfield has really proven this year, not that he's a star, but he's a competent starting quarterback who could get the ball to his top receivers. He's been throwing to Chris Godwin like crazy lately, and their defense is pretty scary. We talked about that week 1 win as if it was like a travesty that they lost to that team. I thought that team might be trying to draft in the top 5, and yet they have really come through actually under Todd Bowles and with Baker Mayfield the quarterback and way overachieved. So which one of those teams do you think ends up winning that division, and which one is battling with the Vikings?
It's hard. The NFC South is just so weird. I thought the Saints were gonna, almost win it by default because of the addition of Derek Carr, and I thought their defense was gonna be really good, which it has been at times this season. Um, but then, Tampa Bay's kind of been sort of that wild card team that, okay, if they can string together a couple of wins, go on a little winning streak, then they could make things really interesting. And they've done that now. They've won 3 games in a row. They're sitting there atop the division. Their schedule, I'm just looking at, what they have to go here. They got Jacksonville coming uh, into town on Christmas Eve this coming Sunday. And then they're hosting the Saints, and then they're playing Carolina, a bad team, in week 18. So you got to figure like they're probably going to win at least one of those games. Probably can almost, I think, almost guarantee they're going to win the Carolina game. Um, but the Jacksonville and New Orleans games, and I think that's what's interesting about like all of these teams is that they're all playing each other. The Rams are going to play the Saints this coming Thursday. And then Tampa Bay is going to play the Saints right after that. So it almost feels like this whole situation is going to solve itself. And if you're the Vikings, obviously you have a little bit more of a rooting interest in like a Tampa Bay because you want to see them win that division so that you don't have to worry about competing with them for one of those wild card spots. Um, but yeah, it's going to be interesting. I tend to think the way Tampa Bay is playing right now, I think they're playing a little bit better than New Orleans is, and I think they're going to ride some of that momentum. Jacksonville's kind of a team that's really talented, but they've had this tendency to kind of lay some eggs, over the course of the season, and that could be one that we see this coming Sunday. So I feel like the way Tampa Bay's playing lately, they looked really good in Green Bay yesterday. I think Tampa Bay is going to win that division somehow in these last 3 games.
I think so too. And again, that does play in the Vikings' favor. Yeah, with Jacksonville, Trevor Lawrence comes out of that game. Not only did he play terribly, but also he's playing on a high ankle sprain and then with a concussion as well. And at some point, uh, you know, that's going to start to affect Trevor Lawrence's performance when he's dealing with these injuries. And I know that he looked a little bit mobile and so forth, but I still wonder about some of the throws that he's been asked to make. And he also clearly is just trying too hard, Trevor Lawrence, to do it all himself and to win everything himself. And I don't think that he has to necessarily do that, but they really don't have the playmakers, the run game that he seems to trust. So that was unfortunate to watch against the Ravens. Also, if the Ravens aren't the favorite going into the playoffs to be the Super Bowl champion, I don't know who is. It would almost be a massive disappointment if they don't find a way to reach the Super Bowl because that team, top to bottom, is, in my mind, the strongest team that Lamar Jackson has ever had around him offensively and then defensively. They have a great coach. They just looked like a juggernaut. So Seattle is harder to comment on since they're playing. That is a little more difficult for us to discuss. But Atlanta, I think, is out, and there's nothing more to say there other than if they had had literally anyone except for Desmond Ritter this year, any level of competency, including like somebody give Andy Dalton a job, somebody give Jacoby Brissett a job. They ignored all that. They were like, oh, Taylor Heineke, who's like not that serviceable of a backup quarterback, and we're buying into Desmond Ritter in that decision. Who would have ever expected, except for everyone through the entire offseason who said, really? Well, you're going to go with him? If they honestly had gotten Gardner Minshew, that man has his team on the precipice of the playoffs. That was something they could have seen coming, but them losing to Carolina is the death knell to their
Awful.
season. I do not see how they overcome that. Somebody asked yesterday on the show, and I'd like your perspective on this so we could spend more time on this. Are the Packers completely cooked here, Manny? We had made a big deal about how their schedule was easy, and then all of a sudden they lost 2 games in a row to easy teams. Were they a fraud in those weeks where everyone was declaring them the next great team in the NFC?
I don't think that they're frauds. I do think that there is, cause for, to sort of pause on like anointing them and anointing Jordan Love as like this guy that's arrived now and he's ready to take that next step as the franchise quarterback. I think the jury's still out a little bit on that. But, again, I think you look at their remaining schedule, they've got Carolina coming up on. They've got probably the easiest opponent of the weekend coming up on Christmas Eve. So you go on the road, you take care of business against Carolina. You're 7-8, and then that game against the Vikings on New Year's Eve becomes just absolutely massive for both teams, really. And if you're the Packers and you find a way to win that game at US Bank Stadium, now you're hosting Chicago in Week 18. You got to figure that's a game that's very winnable as well. So I'm not ready to write the Packers off yet. I know Vikings fans will want me to just say, "Yep, the Packers are terrible and it's over and they're done." But I think you just look at what they have left. There's an opportunity for them to get right back into this and sort of go down swinging. So that Packer Viking game on New Year's Eve, I think, is going to be massive for both teams. It's going to be huge.
Yeah, that could because I really do believe in the Rams here of getting 2 out of their last 3.
Yep.
That really could determine very much, because, I mean, Carolina good for them getting a win, though, honestly, because Bryce Young needs a little bit of something, and every time I look back and I'll watch, like, highlights of the game and so forth, and I'll see 4 or 5 highlight plays from Bryce Young where I go, "I think it's in there, there's just a lot of work to do. There's a lot of construction. It's where you can kind of like someone gives you a floor plan and you're like, oh, that looks like a nice house. And then they show it to you and it's got the windows falling out and the piping is burst and everything else. You're like, oh, okay. There's a lot of construction to be done, but it could be something that still turns out to be good eventually. So good for him getting that win, but I don't think he's going to beat the Packers this week. And really, the discussion about the Packers is twofold here because it's can they get it back together? They have, in my mind, the most lost defensive coordinator in the league. They have forever. Every time the Vikings have gone to play against them, I think, well, they're going to score a ton of points because this defensive system does not work in the NFL anymore. The league changes quickly. Everybody was chasing a certain style, and now they better go chase what Brian Flores is doing because this style is failing. It failed with the Chargers. It's failing here. Look, Vic Fangio's really good at what he does, but when everybody's sort of trying to copy this, like, let's play back and let them catch the ball and tackle them and so forth, like, it's just not working. Playing the same way over and over and over again. I was just having Donatel flashbacks watching that Bucks and Packers game going, this is exactly what we watched last year. They're not adjusting anything. They're not having a lot of guys moving pre-snap. There's not confusion from the quarterback. There's a lot of comfort. And it basically comes down to does Rashawn Gary get like 4 sacks? If he does not, then the opposing quarterback is going to be just fine, which is what we talked about last year with like Daniil Hunter, Zadarius Smith, Patrick Peterson better get a pick, or the opposing quarterback, Mike White, is just going to hang out back there and complete a bunch of passes. Mac Jones throwing for 380. That's what it was like. A perfect quarterback rating for Baker Mayfield against you. Crazy stuff. I don't trust them even against the bad teams to win all
Right.
3 of these, even though it's very possible that they will. And I think that if the Vikings play offensively like they did against Cincinnati, against the Packers with their defense, they could put up 24 points and 400 yards again. And then you're just, hey, can Jordan Love solve Brian Flores this time? Which I have trouble thinking that he can. There was a massive overreaction because that team has been so successful for so long with good quarterbacks that they developed for a couple years. And it's no different than when someone says that Ohio State quarterback can't be good. It's like because all the other ones before who had nothing to do with this man, they all
Right.
prove it. It's like no, Aaron Rodgers has absolutely zero to do with Jordan Love and what he's going to be. What do you think he's going to be, though? Now we got a pretty big sample of Jordan Love playing football. Like, here's another way to frame it. Would you take them? Like, would you say if I offered you them, you could also pick like Chicago, a couple other teams for the future that are going to draft higher? Would you be like, no, I'd rather have the quarterback I know, or I'd rather take a swing at somebody else? Like, how do you assess that? Would you rather be them or the Vikings, who are going to roll the dice at the quarterback position? Are you looking at Jordan Love and saying, you know what, a team should aim higher than that, or where that guy is going to get by next year or whatever is going to be high enough to compete for a Super Bowl?
They're in a hard spot, man, because I don't think I don't I don't know what to think of Jordan Love yet. Mainly because we just haven't seen him play enough. We've seen him play just this season, and that's it. And typically when you're sort of evaluating a young quarterback, you need a pretty large sample size. You need like multiple seasons to really kind of determine like, okay, is this the guy that we want to, when his rookie contract is up, is this the guy that we want to pay a lot of money to and invest in? Can we build a good enough roster around him to have success? I don't I don't know one way or the other with him just because we haven't seen enough. There's been times where he's looked really good, and then there's other times where it's like, dude, where are you throwing the football? He had a throw yesterday where he had a guy wide open. I think it was a fourth down. They were inside like the 10-yard line or something. He had a receiver wide open in the flat in the end zone, and airmailed it over to him by, airmailed it over his head by like 5 yards. It's like, dude, that's a simple throw. That's a simple, basic throw. But then you see him make other throws, and it's like, okay, I see why there were people that kind of liked him because there is talent there. But it's just hard to really get a read on like if is that enough talent to where you want to invest a semi big contract into, you know what I mean? And I don't know if we've seen enough of him to even really like he certainly hasn't shown that you definitely want to go that route. Um, but there's enough talent there where you think like, okay, I could see maybe you giving him that contract, but you just don't know yet. And it's a tough spot for the Packers to be in because if you do give him that money, if you give him like, I don't know, Daniel Jones money or something like that, and he's not that good, now you're stuck. Now you're in a really tough spot. Now you're kind of like where the Giants are right now, where they're not very good and they've got all this money tied up into a quarterback who's not really all that good. And now you're stuck in mediocrity. You're stuck going 8-9, 9-8 all the time. And maybe if everything goes your way, you can make the playoffs a few times, but not much after that. They're in a tough spot, man. And they're going to, maybe these last 3 games can really kind of show you something, but I'm not sure if just after one full season as a starter, if you can, if you're ready to hitch your wagon to a guy like that long term.
I would probably take what's behind door number two for
Yeah,
if you're saying, hey, would you rather take a quarterback high if you're Chicago, or would you rather stick with what you've seen from Jordan Love and believe that he's going to improve on this? I would probably go with Chicago. I don't even think I would think about it too much because I'm aiming higher than what I've seen from Jordan Love. And the thing about Jordan Love is what I'm sure we'll hear a lot. And this always goes with the could be old takes exposed. It's football. It could change, whatever. But this is just I think that what we've seen this year is going to be who he is. I don't think that that's going to change. Now, that doesn't mean he can't have a great year in between somewhere, because if you go through quarterback seasons through history, it's not every single year. Like Kirk is the weirdest one ever because every single year it's basically the same. And he's the
yeah,
only quarterback I can think of who's like that. Like even Patrick Mahomes wins an MVP, but then no one will catch the ball for him this year. One of the worst interceptions you'll ever see off a receiver's hands from Kadarius Toney the other day. Just like, what? I mean, usually circumstances, schedules, injuries, all these things send statistics and PFF scores a little up and down, and somebody could get hot and have a great year. That may happen to Jordan Love because we've seen it even within a season. But I think this inconsistency, especially from an accuracy perspective, you mentioned that throw into the end zone that went wildly over his receiver. I don't think that could be fixed at this point, or maybe ever with certain guys that you're going to have those wild throws. And Josh Allen still has these wild throws that go like to absolutely nowhere, and that's still inside Josh Allen, but he's one of the guys that had, after 3 years at the same point, had increased his accuracy and improved it by leaps and bounds. We saw this from Jalen Hurts over a couple years. Now, I know Jordan Love hasn't been playing, but he's been out of college for multiple years now, and he's had that time to develop, to work with quarterback
right.
coaches and so forth. And now at this point, that makes me think it's going to be hard for him to change that accuracy issue. And I remember before the season, Sam Monson of PFF, their NFL show, he said that Jordan Love might be like Jameis Winston if his head was screwed on straight. And I was like, I think that's right, where like he does some insane throws, and a lot of times if a receiver makes the catch, it gets the highlight reel. If you launch it downfield or you throw into the back of the end zone, like he's got guts and he's going to have a lot of highlight reel throws, but he's also going to have a lot of low light reel throws. You know who was like that too? And talk about like the head being screwed on straight. Carson Wentz was like that. If you go through his
Yeah,
season with the Indianapolis Colts, there is a lot of highs where he actually plays really well and puts up big numbers and leads their offense. And then they lose in the last week to formerly Urban Meyer's Jaguars because he just loses his accuracy altogether. But if you add that with some leadership quality and intelligence, which it seems that Jordan Love has, then that could be a guy who wins you games. The hard part is they're going to have to pay him, as you mentioned. And there's this clock that runs out that suddenly
Yeah.
makes everything so much harder. And then you end up with the potential for like a not quite as tragic Daniel Jones situation. And then they end up getting stuck. So if he doesn't solve the inconsistency issues with his accuracy, you're going to get a lot of this kind of wild ride with Jordan Love for year in and year out, I think.
Yeah, and he's in year 4 now, right? Because was he 2020? He was drafted the COVID year. So they have to decide after this they have to decide this coming off season if he's going to be the guy. You know what I mean? They're gonna have to figure that out if they want to extend him and keep him around. They don't really have a lot of time to like sit back and evaluate and let's see if we can add this piece and that piece and we'll get a couple more draft picks and surround him with even more talent and then everything will be kind of ready to go. The clock is ticking now um on that and that decision you just kind of wonder like are they going to get sort of suckered into a decision, a sort of a rash decision because they don't really have a lot of time to really think about it, and they're tough. They're stuck in this sort of spot of mediocrity, and they're like, well, we're not drafting high enough to draft another guy. We don't really want to trade up to take another guy. Oh, screw it. Let's just pay Jordan Love and just hope for the best. And then if he doesn't turn out, then they're screwed. They're stuck in mediocrity for the next, 5, maybe 6 years.
The irony is that they should probably draft a quarterback this year, which leads
Yeah.
into our next topic, by the way. They should probably draft a quarterback this year because their whole mantra is draft a quarterback when it doesn't seem like you need one. And right now, like, remember, the Packers drafted Brian Brom when Aaron Rodgers was a couple years into his career. And Todd McShay famously was on TV saying, yeah, I actually like Brom more than Aaron Rodgers. And I think they may have gotten their future quarterback. Well, that did not work out and shows you that any of us, no matter the platform, can be very wrong in our predictions in football. But they've always had that as their ideal, which is we're going to draft quarterbacks and see if we could develop them and so forth. They tried it over the years with middle round quarterbacks and things like that. Brett Hundley was the most notable over the years behind Aaron Rodgers, and then with this situation, because they don't know for sure, and because paying him is going to be unclear, then it becomes harder. He did redo his contract before this year, I think, to make this a little bit more stable for them, but they're still going to have a decision to make him a franchise quarterback or not coming down the road very soon. And I don't know if he's going to reach the threshold of somebody that you want to make a $40 million per year quarterback. That's why it's a very hard decision for them. The other argument would be, look, I mean, he made all this progress this year. The receivers are just learning how to play football. They can improve their offensive line. And it was halfway through the season that Matt LaFleur kind of figured out how to play to his strengths. But that one to me is going to be, if they stick with him, it's going to be a year to year. Some years we're going to be like, oh man, they're done with Jordan Love. And some years I think he's going to be good if he gets a year to year situation. With Daniel Jones, that one was maybe that's a little unfair because I think they just tricked out that offense to have him run all the time and throw really short passes. And he had 2 good games against the Vikings and they had to give him all the money. And he just played them like a fiddle. I mean, it was just like give his agent all the credit for taking advantage of those couple of games. But what I wanted to talk about too, and then we'll circle back to the Vikings and making the playoffs and so forth, is how many teams do you think will be in the hunt for quarterbacks for this year? And there's Jordan Love, obviously in the Packers, not really going to be one of them. I'm only like half joking with they should draft a quarterback this year. It is like the thing that they brag about, though. Chicago, there has been some buzz that maybe Chicago should consider staying with Justin Fields because of the progress he's made this year. I don't agree with that at all. I think if you've
Me
got a
neither.
chance to take Caleb Williams or Drake May, you do that. You never apologize to anyone. But there's maybe a situation where they don't move on from him, like they don't trade him away. And instead, they leave him there on the roster. This would be like Christian Ponder with Teddy Bridgewater, where they left him on the roster, let that play out with his contract just in case he ends up playing over, beating out the rookie quarterback in training camp and then taking some huge step, and then they could trade the other guy or something. That might be the way to go. That's a little weird and is certainly going to have a ton of controversy that goes along with it if they do it that way. But there has been enough flickers of Justin Fields to think that he could start in the league and win games with a team, but is not a guy, again, that you want to make your franchise quarterback. Are we in 100% mode that they end up drafting whoever they get at the top with Carolina's pick?
I think so, because how many opportunities are you going to get like this if you're the Bears going forward? You know what I mean? And they're in a good spot in that they're going to have two, certainly a pick that's likely to be number one overall, and then their own draft pick, which might end up being in the top 10. That's a good spot to be in. They're going to have cap space. They've got some young players to kind of grow and develop, and an opportunity to get even more young players to kind of build. And I think it makes a lot of sense for them to just sort of wipe the slate clean. It might be a little awkward to start out with Justin Fields if he's still on the roster. It might be a little uncomfortable, but if you go with Caleb Williams or Drake May and that guy is a stud, you don't have to apologize for the 2024 season being a little bit awkward. You know what I mean? Because if everything works out long term for you, then I think everybody will be fine. And then you maybe trade Justin Fields and send him to a spot where he can maybe have a little bit more success. Another team that's willing to take a chance on him, perhaps, and give him an opportunity. But if you hit on that guy with your top pick, I don't think there's any apologizing that will be necessary. So if I'm the Bears, I take, I do my due diligence on one of those two guys, May or Williams, make the decision, and not look back with any regrets.
So there's a bunch of bubble teams for quarterbacks. I'm going to give you the ones that I wrote down of where I was like, maybe, but this is kind of weird. Uh, and you could tell me what you think. Tampa Bay is actually a maybe, but it's kind of weird because Baker Mayfield has played them well enough to get here. Seattle is another one. Maybe it's kind of weird because they
Yeah.
invested in Geno Smith, but they really didn't invest long term. Actually, after next year, they could get out of that contract for almost nothing. And that was what I was using to talk about if they re-signed Josh Dobbs. Was it just things change
Yeah.
fast, folks. I was like looking at this Geno Smith contract, I'm like, you know what? If they gave Josh Dobbs that same deal, that might be pretty good. Oh, what a league. What a league. But yeah, I mean, Seattle, I think the Falcons are probably a lock. The Giants are the other one that do they need so much that they should just stay with Daniel Jones and wait to try to give the next quarterback a better situation? Or should they just draft somebody else because Daniel Jones is bad? So Tampa Bay, Seattle, and the Giants. What do you think of them for quarterbacks?
I'll start with Seattle. I think it makes a ton of sense for Seattle if they can get themselves in a position to maybe, it would probably be a situation where they would have to try and move up. Because they're kind of sitting in a similar spot. They're a little bit behind the Vikings in the standings, but if they finish, I don't know, with like they end up with like the 14th or 15th pick, that's a pretty good spot to maybe move yourself into the top, 6 or 7. And if there's a guy there that you really like, I think it makes a ton of sense for them to do that, because you've got Geno Smith, who's a veteran, who's been in the league for a decade. He's under contract for a couple more seasons. So that's a situation where you draft your young guy, you let him sit behind Geno, for a year or two, and then by the time Geno's ready to move on, you've got your young quarterback that you've already invested in behind the scenes, ready to step in and take over the keys of the franchise. So I think for Seattle, it makes a ton of sense to do it this year. If not this year, I think next year would make even more sense for them to go that route. So Seattle, I think, is in a good spot. I don't. It is interesting, like, how long is Pete Carroll going to continue to coach there too? I mean, that might be kind of a thing. Like, Pete is what, 72 now. I mean, is he gonna if he's gonna stick around? It's not. he still coaches with a lot of energy and a lot of passion and enthusiasm. So he doesn't really seem like he's that old, but we know that he's been around for so long. So it's like, okay, if you're Pete Carroll, do you want to start the process of like going with a young quarterback yet, or do you want to kind of make one more push for like a playoff run or something like that before you walk off into the sunset and end your career? So, but I think, just from a roster standpoint, I think it makes a ton of sense for Seattle to start investing in a young quarterback now while you have sort of a bridge guy under contract, and that way you can kind of slow cook things with that young guy.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the thing is that I'm only even looking at the NFC here. There's so many teams. There's so many teams because,
Oh, the
I mean,
AFC, yeah.
Washington is another one that to me is a lock. I don't know. Like Sam Howell has impressed me at times, but looks to me like very much a backup quarterback or a journeyman type quarterback that somebody needs to fill in, and you know that you're going to get like decent quarterback play, but is not going to be someone that can elevate to the level of a Super Bowl type of caliber quarterback. How about Arizona? Let's say you're in a position as Arizona to, just the way that these last few weeks work out, to trade Kyler Murray for, let's just call it, 2 first-round draft picks to the Minnesota Vikings, or and draft Drake May, or stick with Kyler Murray and draft Marvin Harrison Jr. Like, which one are you doing?
Ooh, that's yeah. You kind of caught me off guard there because I wasn't even thinking about like trading Kyler Murray to the Vikings because that kind of causes me to raise my eyebrows a little bit. The Cardinals are interesting though because they've already paid Kyler Murray, so the contract is a pretty big contract. You don't really have the luxury of like building around a quarterback that has a rookie cheap contract. So, the clock is kind of been accelerated a little bit. They've been in a weird spot because there's been a lot of instability in the front office and with coaching and all of that stuff. It seems like they've got a pretty good coach now, Jonathan Gannon, but um, and Kyler's played well at times since he's been back. Um, I think if you're the Cardinals, if you've got a chance, if Gannon really likes Kyler Murray, I think it makes sense to keep him, and you take Marvin Harrison Jr., give Kyler Murray another weapon to throw to, and you see how that goes. You start trying to maybe build that defense because that defense is not great. You just kind of use some draft picks and whatever free agency money you have to try and build that defense and get yourself into contention. It's tough right now because San Francisco's like owning that division, so you're probably still a little bit of ways away from competing for the division championship. But the Rams are kind of a 500 team right now, and so Seattle's kind of in a similar spot too. So you've got a chance, I think, if you make a couple of moves over the next couple of years, you can maybe get yourself into like a wild card situation. And who knows how long this window is actually in for San Francisco. If things fall off for them, you make all the right decisions. You've got your quarterback already, seemingly with Kyler Murray. You might be able to take a pretty significant leap. So I would, if I'm them, I would stick with Kyler Murray. Um, I would keep an open ear. If a team is willing to give me 2 first-round picks for him, might have to think about that. And then still, I mean, hell, maybe you still take Marvin Harrison Jr. because he's that freaking good. But um, I think right now I would stick with Kyler Murray and go with Marvin Harrison, and then try to build the roster in other ways.
I am so intrigued by this idea of Kyler Murray that it's been coming up on the show since the summertime,
Yeah.
of trading for him and pairing him with Justin Jefferson. Kevin O'Connell loves pushing the ball down the field. Well, buddy, Kyler Murray can push the ball down the field. Jordan
Yep.
Addison is a star. They're making Nick Mullins look pretty good at times in that football game with some very inaccurate throws, and they're catching him anyway. And, TJ Hawkinson underneath, like, I don't know. And, you could say, well, he doesn't like a running quarterback because of Dobbs. Why? I mean, I don't know. Like, he would design the whole offense over the whole summer for Kyler Murray, and to take advantage somewhat of his running ability. I don't think Dobbs tells us anything about anything. That's just a very small sample where they would have had to change the offense a ton on the fly. So I'm throwing that out. I also wonder, so when he was with the Rams, they did well against Arizona in the division. Like he had trouble against the Rams defense, if I recall, but he would have a lot of intel on Kyler Murray. Like, was it as bad as people said with his leadership, or was that overstated because Cliff Kingsbury was bad? And I haven't heard anything about that this year, that he seems to have come back just fine with Jonathan Gannon. So was it a personality conflict, or was Cliff Kingsbury just bad? Like nobody wanted him after he got fired and he's working for like USC or something. So there's a lot of stuff there that I could see us debating. Everybody also remember there was like a minute there where we thought the Vikings could go after Lamar Jackson, and there was a good number of fans who were like, I don't know, too much money for Lamar. Oh no, 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 no. It's not too, it's not like this would be very interesting if they were going to do that. The cap implications would be difficult, but not impossible. And for Arizona, though, if you're making an argument to stick with them, it's look at the Lions. So the Lions get Jared Goff when they're in a very low spot, and they say, we've got stability. Let's build everything around that guy and draft and develop players and find some dudes in the fourth round like Amon-Ra St. Brown, draft super high stars to put with him, and you could create a pretty darn competitive team. So I think that they could go either way with this. But man, if you're talking 2 first-round draft picks, I think the Vikings are in position to actually do that if they wanted to, with the where the roster stands and how few needs they actually have outside of getting, another pass rusher. That would mean Danielle Hunter is gone, so you'd need to find a way to, get another pass rusher. But it's an interesting idea that I think is going to keep coming up. So I don't want to go through like every team, but those were just some in the NFC that kind of stood out to me. And I think at the end of the discussion, it's always like, I think the Vikings are going to have a lot of competition when it comes to a different quarterback, which kind of leads us to back to the Kirk thing and everything else. But I was thinking about this as we're getting closer. We know what teams are now and how they can feel about their quarterbacks. Arizona may swing the whole thing because if they don't get to the top, then they might have to just draft Marvin Harrison Jr. because they can't get the other two quarterbacks anyway. So these final few weeks will be really compelling in that race for Caleb Williams and Drake May. Let's wrap up on this, Manny. The playoffs and the Minnesota Vikings. What would it mean to you? I'm going to give you 2 different scenarios. They're very simple. What would it mean to you if the Minnesota Vikings made the playoffs at 9-8? What would it mean to you if the Vikings made it at 8-9? And what would it mean to you if they missed the playoffs altogether? Run through those three for me.
Okay, well, I think that if they finish 9-8 and make the playoffs, I would look at Kevin O'Connell and say, "Hey, man, it looked ugly at times, but bravo for you to pull that off, losing your starting quarterback halfway through the season, and inserting a guy that you just traded for from Arizona, and he comes in and wins a couple games for you. Things kind of fell apart for him, but then you shifted gears and you still found a way to get in. I would just say, hey, bravo, man. It's long term, big picture wise, it probably doesn't make a lot of sense to make the playoffs, but just as far as a coaching job overall for the season, my hat would go off to them. If they go 8-9, I don't know. I would probably feel some type of way about it because I would kind of feel like, well, wouldn't it just made more sense to just lose another game and just miss the playoffs altogether? You know what I mean? Because it seems to make the most sense to do that. Because it's like, well, what did you really accomplish here? You know what I mean? And you're still talking about them making the playoffs, but it's like if it's 8-9, and it's like, well, you probably could have lost another game and missed the playoffs, and you'd be in a better position for your future. Um, and obviously, at I'd say that to say this. I mean, you finish 7-10, it would suck. It would be a really bad ending to the season. But you know what? You have a decent draft pick. You are in a better spot to maybe trade up and get a quarterback in next spring's draft. So I would say I'd be totally cool with that. If you drop these last 3 games, I'm all good with that. I'm not saying intentionally go and do that, but I'm good with it if it happens.
I completely agree with all of that. If you lose the last 3 games, I'm sure that it will be ugly and frustrating, and we'll walk out of those games and just be like, "Man, what a collapse from being in the driver's seat." After I mean, the New Orleans game where your percentage to make the playoffs goes up to, like, 80% at that point, and you're feeling like you control your own destiny and all those words that we love to use, and then to just let it slip away and miss the playoffs, like, ouch, that would be pretty rough as far as how it felt in the moment. But then in the long term, it's just hard to be too upset about it, because if you make the playoffs by one game and then lose in the first round, what difference does it make? You were just a road cone for somebody else's season to carry on, and you'd rather just draft higher. If they win 9, it will be impressive. I don't care if Kevin O'Connell blows some play calls or some game management or some player usage or runs another trick play that sucks. Like, it just, I know, like, those things we nitpick the heck out of because that's what we do. And that's why we love the game, is because we can do that. But in the big, you got to look at the big picture there. Very similar to with the Lions winning on the last day to knock out the Packers last year. I don't necessarily believe, hey, year to year momentum or whatever. But in that situation, I thought, all right, this Lions team has got something there. Like the way that they fought back from where they were last year under Dan Campbell to get a win in the last game, the way they played, like they just showed a lot of promise. And to get 9 wins, this team, I would say, showed a ton of promise. And in the big picture, they competitively rebuilt, developed a ton of players that are going to go forward with this team and be a big deal. And I would say, like, the expectation, regardless of even what happens at quarterback, is that this team is very soon a significant and serious contender. That's how I'd walk out at 9-8. So 7-10 is like, there's a lot of work to do, and they're going to draft higher, so that's good. And then 9-8 is, man, like, I know we shouldn't raise fake banners, but that's a pretty good accomplishment considering what you went through. 8-9 is kissing your sister, is what they say when you get a tie. Like, I'll just say it feels like a tie. It feels like,
Yeah,
well, it wasn't the worst, but it wasn't the best. And they gave you a playoff spot. They should just get rid of the 7 seed then.
yeah.
And like, did you earn it? Not really, but you kind of fell into it, and you were never that good to begin with. And so, congrats, I guess. Yeah, I mean, I think it would be a very conflicted feeling because you're going to draft lower being sub 500, and that's just not good for anybody. So it's, yeah, it is one of those things where one game could swing the way that we feel entirely about this season, and it is most certainly to do so. And you know what, Manny, I wouldn't be surprised if there's some one score games mixed in to these final 3. So of course we will be breaking it all down, and we will do a hardcore Vikings Lions preview, which will have a lot of fun with a Manny list for Thursday night. So let's do it then, Manny. Always fun getting together with you, and I'll talk to you on Thursday.
Sounds like a plan.